Welcome into an Always College Football YouTube exclusive, and we thought this was timely and it made sense. We are in the world of brackets with March Madness rolling along and controversy that always seemingly finds its way into college playoff rankings. Yes, for March Madness, there's 68 teams, but man, teams 69, 70, 71, and 72, they sure are ticked off when they are excluded from the tournament. We've had that forever in college football, especially in the four-team era where we had team 5, 6, 7, 8 that all felt like they deserved a chance to play for the title. So it made us think, what are the biggest controversies surrounding the college football playoff? The teams that had the best arguments to be included and yet were excluded for one specific reason or another. So we figured we'd dive in, and we'd do so here with our top 5 college football playoff controversies. Let's start with number 5. That would be the year 2020. One of the most controversial college football playoff years ever, because some teams played 5 games, 6 games, 7 games. Others played 10 or 11. And if you include conference championships, maybe 12. That was one of the most chaotic years ever. And for those of you that did not live it, it was wild in every possible way. Ohio State played in just 6 regular season games. They beat Penn State, they beat Indiana, they beat Northwestern in the Big Ten championship game. Notre Dame was brought into the ACC that year. They went 10-0. They then lost to Clemson in the ACC title game, even though they beat Clemson in South Bend without Trevor Lawrence, but DJ Uiagalelei was making his second start there. They also beat North Carolina, and then they found their way in. And then Texas A&M was the lone exclusion. There was a lot of people that were kind of rallying in favor of A&M. They went 8-1 in the regular season, but the big pushback with A&M, they lost to Alabama, the eventual national champion, by 28 points. All right, they did beat number 4, but they were left out in favor of Notre Dame, who started the season 10-0, but lost to the ACC champion. So a dramatic year in 2020, including several teams that had strong arguments, including an Indiana team that at one point I think had a pretty strong argument to play in the Big Ten title game. It was crazy. I don't want to relive it. I like it when everybody plays the same amount of games. That's helpful, at least when it comes to evaluating these teams. Let's go next to number 4, biggest controversy. This was in 2016 when Ohio State was put in ahead of Penn State, even though Penn State beat Ohio State in the regular season. Remember, Washington also was in the mix, but the biggest controversy surrounded Penn State being on the outside as Big Ten champs, but with 2 losses, and Ohio State being on the inside because they only had the 1 loss. Ohio State, because of that loss, wasn't able to participate in the Big Ten championship game. That was Penn State, who owned the head-to-head. Penn State won the Big Ten. Penn State went on to play in the Rose Bowl game in a classic against SC, so it all worked out really well. But they lost 2 games in the first 4 games of the year. They started that season 2-2. They lost to Pitt. They lost to Michigan. That loss to Michigan was a pretty significant black eye, I might add. They lost 49-10, but then they went on to rally to win 8 straight games, including that win against Ohio State. And the head-to-head that year was ignored by the College Football Playoff Committee. Why was it ignored? Because Penn State had 2 losses, both of which were in convincing fashion. Ohio State had 1 that was against Penn State, who returned a blocked field goal to the house for the game-winning score. So very dramatic season, very fun season to follow, and one that we still talk about regularly, partly because of Ohio State's performance in that playoff game against Clemson. They lost 31-0 in the playoff game. Okay, that playoff game was one that you would like to forget. That Clemson team went on to win the national championship, so all was good. But maybe Penn State would have given Clemson a little better fight with how they were playing at the end of the season. Number 3, one of the biggest ones, for depending on who you ask. I don't think this was as controversial as some others do, because I acknowledge that there is a difference between the G5 and the P5. Always felt this way, but many people back in 2017 did not get on board with that. UCF was left out after a 12-0 regular season win, or 12-0 regular season schedule. They beat number 22 South Florida. They also beat Memphis in the AAC championship game. They beat Maryland convincingly 38-10. Not a great Maryland team, but still a Power 5 team nonetheless. And they went on to beat Auburn in the Peach Bowl. Obviously, by the time that Peach Bowl went down, the playoff was already established. Alabama got in favor of UCF. Alabama was 11-1. They lost to Auburn in the final game of the regular season. Auburn then went on to play Georgia in the SEC title, lose to Georgia. Georgia was in. Alabama was then in. Because of Auburn's loss, they slid into the 4 seed at 11-1. What was amazing about that year was Alabama then went on to beat Clemson. Georgia played Oklahoma in what was one of the great Rose Bowl games of all time. And then Alabama and Georgia had an incredible national championship performance where Tua Tagovailoa came off the bench at halftime to complete the comeback and lead Alabama to a national championship game win. Meanwhile, UCF was sitting there. They took care of business. They were undefeated, and they were rewarded with a national championship given to them by, I don't recall the poll, but they claimed the national championship. It still lives up in the bounce house. And the drama and the controversy about not giving UCF a chance continues to be a hot topic of debate for us that have followed the sport for a very long time. At number 2, this was a big one. In 2014, the first year of the 4-team college football playoff, it was a 3-horse race there at the end of the season. TCU was sitting there going into the final week as the number 3 ranked team in the college football playoff committee rankings. They went on to absolutely destroy someone in the final game of the season. That was pretty much at that point, people felt like TCU was going to secure a spot. They were number 3. They had a big win in the final game. They were sitting there waiting on selection day to see whether or not their name would be called. Meanwhile, TCU had just one loss that year. That loss came to Baylor in what was a crazy game. Baylor won that game 61-58 in dramatic fashion. Baylor came from behind, erased a pretty significant deficit to give TCU their only loss. Therefore, Baylor held the head-to-head over TCU, but the Big 12 at that time did not have a conference championship game. So they were named co-champions. Meanwhile, Ohio State was sitting there in 2014. They lost the second game of the season to Virginia Tech. Remember, Ohio State in the preseason lost their starting quarterback, Braxton Miller, so they had some growing pains early in the year with J.T. Barrett as their starter. J.T. Barrett then later in the season gets hurt. He is replaced by Cardale Jones, who in his first career start beats Wisconsin in the Big Ten championship game 59-0. That performance in the Big Ten title game of 59-0, knowing that I think the College Football Playoff Committee was a little bit torn between TCU, who looked better, and Baylor, who had the head-to-head win. Therefore, they went with the lesser of many evils. They went with Ohio State with a third-string quarterback, Cardale Jones. They put them in. That Ohio State team goes on to win the national championship, supporting the decision that the College Football Playoff Committee made. But it was not without crazy drama and chaos there on Selection Day, the first time we did it in the 4-team playoff era. And then finally, the biggest controversy, and I'm not sure any other controversy will ever come close to what we experienced in 2023, where an undefeated Florida State, who sat there with a 13-0 regular season and ACC championship crown. They beat Louisville 16-6, and it was an underwhelming offensive performance by the Seminoles. Seminoles earlier in the year had lost Jordan Travis to a broken leg, and as a result, their offense really floundered down the stretch, and it left a seed of doubt as to whether or not they would be super competitive in a college football playoff setting. Jordan Travis meant so much to that team, and as a result, he was one of the highest vote getters in the Heisman Trophy, even though he missed the last game and a half or 2 games there with a broken leg. Alabama, on the other hand, was 11-1 in the regular season. They lost to the Texas Longhorns in the second week of the regular season, but they had rallied to win 10 straight regular season games. And then they beat the defending national champion, 2-time defending national champion, the Georgia Bulldogs, in the SEC championship game in rather convincing fashion. Alabama wins that game. They are now 12-1, winners of the SEC. So you have the conversation. The undefeated Florida State team without their starting quarterback, or the Alabama team that lost early, had fixed their problems and had gotten better and better and better and just had the biggest win of the season in their convincing victory over the Georgia Bulldogs. The committee went with Alabama, and still to this day, it is still one of the most dramatic and controversial decisions in the history of the college football playoff. That'll do it for us here at Always College Football. If you're new to the show, check it out anytime. You can download the show wherever you get your podcast by subscribing to the podcast. You can also check us out on the ESPN College Football YouTube page. So for all of us here at ACF, for Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. We hope you have an amazing day. And remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.